Hello, everyone. We are back with our next class, and we are very excited about it. Again, my name is Erin Schertz with Roots Tech, and we are here with Beth Taylor from the Family Search Library. And I'm really excited about this because Beth is an excellent speaker. She's spoken at Roots Tech many times before. She does lots of live webinars for the Family Search Library that you can check in every month for their newest content. And she works as a United States and Canada research specialist at the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. Her specialty includes DNA, Quakers, land records, probate records, and more. So, Beth, thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to have you talk about the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses, U.S. immigration 1820 to 1954. So with that, I'll let you take over.
Wonderful. Thanks, Erin. And thanks for joining us today as we talk about immigration. So I'm going to focus today on immigration into the United States because that's a huge number of people came into the U.S. and we really need to focus on how to get back to the country of origin or to your homeland before you can move forward. So we're going to focus again on resources here in the U.S. that are going to help you with that process. So let's go ahead and get started. See if I can get my things working. So the one thing I want to focus on a little bit is this. For a lot of people, when they first get researching and they're so excited about doing family history and they're so excited about tracing their ancestors, they find that ancestor that was born in Germany and they might have this kind of information. So you might say, okay, my ancestor, John Smith, he was born around 1863. He was born in Germany. So now I'm going to go and look at German resources to find John Smith because it's going to be super easy, right? In reality, it's not going to be that easy unless you have more information. So when you want to start researching in another country like Germany or Sweden or England or Mexico or China, wherever you are trying to find your ancestors, make sure that you've exhausted the resources in the US and that you have a lot more detail. So if instead of saying I'm looking for John Smith, born around 1863 in Germany, I said I'm looking for Johann Schmidt, who was born the 27th of March in a specific town in Prussia, and I have an immigration date and a naturalization date, and I know his parents' names, and I have a couple of brothers' names. When I start looking at records in Germany, I'm going to know that I found the right John Smith because, you know, the name you're looking for might be really common. So that's why this class is focused on helping you focus or start with records here in the United States before you start talking about records in another country. Because again, finding if you've got a good name, a date, a specific place, a town is what you need. A lot of people think, oh, I've got Prussia. Well, Prussia is a little bit too big. You need an actual town in Prussia. And then if you've got some relationships like parents or siblings or other things like that, that's what you need before you want to start doing that research in Germany. So again, that's why we're going to focus today on the research here in the United States. So our objectives today, we are going to start with some history and background of immigration. We're going to talk about the clues that you're going to find in U.S. records. What records here in the United States are going to give you some clues about your immigrant ancestor. Then we'll talk about some records, the immigration records here in the U.S., some various types of records, and then also delve a little bit into a few resources you can use in the country of origin or your ancestors' homeland, though these are kind of last resort records. Then we're going to go through some research strategies. How do you actually approach doing immigration research? And then we're going to end the class by talking about some resources that you can use to help find these records that we've been talking about. And we'll focus mostly on those immigration records because we're going to talk about a lot of records today. So let's start with some history and background of immigration here in the U.S. I put together kind of a little chart or a little graph showing the rate of immigration over time. So you can see we've got some peaks in around 1854, 1873, 1882. Our big peaks are about 1907 and 1914. And then after about 1924, we'll talk about why this happens. The immigration rates pretty much drop for a number of years. So we can kind of see that immigration, it's not, an increasing graph or an increasing number every single year. It kind of ebbs and flows the number of ancestors or the number of people that came here to the United States. So let's talk about some of the reasons for those ebbs and those flows. First off, we do want to consider immigration law. So what kinds of records are being created, or what are the limitations placed on immigration rights here in the US that might have influenced your ancestor and their decision to immigrate? So first off, we have the 1819 Steerage Act. And the 1819 Steerage Act is kind of one of the big immigration acts for the United States. It's also known as an act regulating passenger ships and vessels. And the 1819 Steerage Act actually is the first act that required that passenger lists be kept. So this is why we kind of started the class with the year 1820, is because that's when the Steerage Act went into effect. Because prior to that date, there are no immigration records. There's nobody kind of trying to track who's coming and how many are coming. That this act did require that those passenger lists be filed with a customs agent at the port of arrival. And if there was no customs agent, they did not keep passenger lists. So, early on, there's not as many passenger lists as we would like. And so tracking immigrants can be a little bit more difficult. Those passenger lists were forwarded to the U.S. Secretary of State. And this law did go into effect the 1st of January of 1820. So again, starting in around 1820, tracing immigrant ancestors becomes a little bit easier because suddenly the U.S. government is keeping a copy of all those passenger lists. Now, there are a few ports that do have pre-1820 passenger lists, specifically Philadelphia did start keeping in 1800, but for the most part, you won't find all of the passenger lists centralized prior to this date. The next act that really influenced not only the number of immigrants that came, but the process that they came and also the records that were created is the 1891 Immigration Act. This is also known as an act, an amendment to the various acts relative to immigration. Very specific, right? But this act started really tightening up some regulations around immigration. So starting in 1891, passenger lists were no longer filed with the customs agent at the port of arrival. Now they had federal inspection agents. And these federal inspection agents had actually been around since 1855, an act that was passed in 1855. But at that point, they had been inspecting the ships. But starting in 1891, they start inspecting the people. So kind of that traditional Ellis Island story we tell, that they had to come and be inspected and their health was checked. That's what this act instituted. Now, those agents would actually board the ship prior to docking and make sure that everything was in place and that the passenger list was thorough and complete and everything was above board. Now, this act was also the first attempt to start recording people who entered the country across the Canadian and Mexican borders. So this act actually allowed for inspection stations to be established on the borders. Those stations were not built or did not start working until a few years after this. But this act, again, really just changed the way that immigrants were processed and the way that they came into the country. And again, the records that were created. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then we have the 1924 Immigration Act. The 1924 Immigration Act, also known as an act to limit the immigration of aliens into the United States, was actually an attempt to decrease immigration rates. There's always been a little bit of fear of immigrants. So at this point, all incoming immigrants were required to receive a visa or to obtain a visa prior to actually getting on board the ship. Those visas were obtained at the consular office or a U.S. embassy at their port of departure. And then it also set quotas on the number of immigrants from each specific homeland that could come each year. And so by combining that, the requirement with getting the visa and the quota made it a little bit trickier to come to the US, especially if you were from some areas where the total number of immigrants from that country were, the number allowed was much smaller. And those quotas were actually set based on the population from that country in the 1890 census. So populations where we'd had a lot of immigrants had come from Western and Northern Europe prior to 1890, and so it kind of benefited those immigrants over immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So that's kind of one thing you want to think about, is how are those acts limiting people or encouraging immigration or discouraging immigration? Another thing you want to consider is what we call the push and pull factors. Why did people immigrate? Because one of the questions you might want to consider about your own immigrant ancestors is, why did they come to the United States? Why did they make that journey? Because it's not an easy thing to move to a whole new area, a language you don't speak, and try and start over. So there's got to be something either pushing you out of your homeland or pulling you to the United States. So some of the push factors that you want to consider is there are countries that were requiring military service, and young men of 18 might say, hey, I'm not going to serve in the military, so instead they choose to immigrate. You get things like famine, famously the Irish potato famine led a huge number of Irish to come to the United States, settle very heavily in Boston and the New York areas. There was a lot of overcrowding in Europe and in other countries. Kind of just keep in mind, we get the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. A lot of people are moving into the cities. The cities are a little bit too full, and that kind of leads to people choosing to come to the United States. Tied into that is unemployment. You can't find a job. There's too many other people, limited social mobility, and a lot of political upheaval or unrest is happening. And all of these are reasons that people might choose not to immigrate, or choose to immigrate, I should say, to leave the country. And some of the things that are pulling them specifically to the United States, what we call pull factors, are things like the prevalence of land. The US, you didn't have to be in the nobility in order to own property. And so you could just show up, and if you'd been here long enough, you got 160 acres for free, or for about $18, because you had to pay filing costs. You think about that kind of a draw. Hey, I can show up and they're just going to give me land. I'm going to head out west and settle somewhere. Of course, there's things like religious freedom. There's a lot more employment opportunities, or different employment opportunities. And there's also something we call chain migration, where you had relatives who had moved to the United States and they wrote a letter home and said, hey, it's gorgeous, you should come, or there's land, or there's opportunities. And so the family moves. Or with chain migration, sometimes it's one family member at a time. Dad comes over, he saves up money, sends money back. The two oldest boys come over and join dad. They save up money, send money back. The next family members come. And so they come in kind of little pieces as they can afford it. So again, these are all reasons why you would want to come to the United States. So kind of thinking through your own ancestors' immigration journey, kind of think why they came. What are the push factors in their homeland? And what are the pull factors in the United States that are kind of encouraging them to come here? So kind of coming back to our chart, or our graph of immigration rates, you can see that all of these things, that the push factors, the pull factors, the acts that we talked about, and a number of other things are coming together to encourage immigration to the United States. You notice that 1924 Immigration Act actually explains why we get a big drop-off in immigration rates. The other thing to keep in mind, and I thought this was interesting, I didn't really pull it out, but a lot of the times where we get really major dips in immigration, it's either because we're in the middle of a war. Nobody wants to immigrate to the US in the middle of the Civil War. Doesn't sound really appealing to me. Or when there's a financial panic, such as the Great Depression, or there's the panics of 1893 and 1895. There are several financial crises. And those are times when you see lower immigration rates, just simply because people are saying, hey, this isn't a good time to immigrate. But again, kind of think through, this is part of your ancestors' immigration journey. It's part of why they came, and it might also help figure out what kinds of records might exist because of their choice when to come or where they settled. The other thing you want to consider is immigration routes. How did they get to the United States? And I find that a lot of people just make the assumption that everybody came on the Liverpool to New York route. It's a pretty simple route. It's a pretty straightforward route. But so most people are looking for their ancestor when you're researching them. You're looking them in the Port of New York's immigration records or their passenger lists. Keep in mind that there are other major ports in the United States. You have, in addition to New York, you've got Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and there are a large number of people who actually sailed around Florida and settled in New Orleans or Galveston, Texas. So they might have actually arrived at a different port than you're looking for. So kind of keep in mind, don't get so focused on New York as the port of arrival that you don't notice them showing up through a different port. There is also a major immigration route through Canada. A lot of times it was actually a little bit cheaper to bring immigrants into up through St. Lawrence to Quebec, and then they would cross the border into New York. Oftentimes the shipping companies themselves would actually sell a combined ticket. So this is going to get to the US, but we're going to go through Canada first, and then you'll cross the border. So keep in mind that your ancestor might have come that route. And if you remember, the 1891 Immigration Act didn't actually allow for inspection stations on the border until that time period. And those wouldn't even open, some of them, until 1895. So if they're crossing the border from Canada, they might not show up on passenger lists as well. And then when you're thinking about Europe, also think about the fact, whether they're coming from Europe or elsewhere, but that they have to get to a port. So they might not go to a port that's the country within the country that they live in. One of my ancestors actually came from Württemberg in Germany and sailed out of Le Havre, France. So don't kind of get so focused that they have to have come from a port in their own homeland. All they need to do is get to the coast and find a port. So look for the closest port regardless of country that they come from. And again, there's other immigration routes out of Europe, including one that is pretty common, where you would sail to one side of England and take a train across England to Liverpool and then go from there. So they might have actually taken two ships along with a short train ride. The one last thing I want to talk about as we discuss the history and background of immigration is specifically about the Port of New York. Because as I work at the Family Search Library and I've helped a lot of people, I think there's some misunderstandings as to when Ellis Island existed. Because we all want our ancestors to have had that Ellis Island experience. However, the Port of New York has quite a different history than that. So first off, it wasn't until 1810 that New York passed Philadelphia as the busiest port. Prior to that, more people had came into Philadelphia than to New York. But once starting in 1810, things had kind of settled down following the American Revolutionary War, then New York does pick up as the busiest port. However, up until 1855, immigrants just landed at the Port of New York. There wasn't a specific place that they landed at. Obviously you'd have to land at the docks, but there was no inspection station or anything like that. In 1855, Castle Garden opened, and Castle Garden was kind of it's an estate inspection station that the state of New York maintained, and it was supposed to help immigrants kind of, process them and get them going. And Castle Garden actually ended up closing in 1890. The reason Castle Garden closed was because of the Immigration Act of 1891 that was shifting the responsibility from the state to the federal government. So at this point, Castle Garden is no longer active. The biggest problem with Castle Garden was because it's actually located on the tip of Manhattan. A lot of we got a few less than honest characters who would hang around the docks, and they might speak the language of these incoming immigrants, and then they would oftentimes cheat them out of their hard-earned savings, because they'd speak the language and they would make promises that they couldn't keep. And there was a lot of concern that this was happening, that these immigrants were losing things, losing their life savings, losing their possessions right as they came into the country. So instead, they wanted to create a station that was not part of the city of New York itself, which is why they actually built Ellis Island. So Ellis Island actually opened its doors in 1892. If you're wondering, between 1890 and 1892, the incoming immigrants were processed by federal inspection agents at what was called the Battery, which is on the tip of Manhattan. So it was still a federal inspection station, just hadn't moved to Ellis Island yet. So Ellis Island doesn't open until January 1st, 1892, the first immigrant through Ellis Island is an Irish teenager, whether she was 12 or 14 is kind of in question. Her name was Annie Moore, and she was given a gold, I think it was a gold coin or a gold dollar to kind of celebrate the opening of Ellis Island. And now Ellis Island was active actually until 1897 when it burned, and then was rebuilt when it opened again in 1900. So it was closed for a little time period, and again they just reverted to using the Battery on the tip of Manhattan as the inspection station. Now in 1924, after the 1924 Immigration Act was passed that set those quotas, it meant that everybody had to get a visa before they even left their country of origin. And so the kind of the purpose of Ellis Island was diminished. There wasn't a lot of need for it. So after 1924, only people who couldn't get a visa before they left, which were including war refugees like during World War II and displaced persons like refugees, those were the only ones who were processed through Ellis Island. So Ellis Island really, the 1924 Act kind of cut down the need for Ellis Island. So really Ellis Island is really only in the effect from about 1890 to 1924 is when its kind of heyday is, when a lot of immigrants came through that port or came through Ellis Island. So if your ancestor came before or after, their immigration story is slightly different than the Ellis Island experience. And then Ellis Island officially closed in 1954. Okay, so those are just kind of some background information about U.S. immigration to just kind of get you thinking about your immigrant ancestor, why they would have come, what kinds of records might have been created for their immigration journey. Next up, I want to talk about the U.S. records that actually have clues about your ancestors' immigration, when they came and what port they might have arrived at, and what ship they arrived on, kind of those questions that you want to ask in order to figure out the town that they came from in their country of origin, that they came from in their homeland. Like I mentioned earlier, you need those details in order to actually start researching in the homeland itself. So let's take a look at some records. So you want to start with these records. So before I even start looking for immigration records, I oftentimes look for immigration clues in other records. So consider things like home sources, census records, vital records, and we'll go through all of these in a minute. Obituaries, church records, county histories, naturalization records, and military records. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that these are all records with secondary information about immigration, and so they may contain some errors, there might be some conflicts between the different records, but it's a good starting point. So let's take a look at these different record types and what kinds of clues about immigration that they include. So let's start with home sources. What do we mean by home sources? Sometimes we call these privately held records, but these are things like your family Bibles, letters, naturalization papers like certificates, pictures, or and so forth. Just lots of interesting information. Kind of think about letters and pictures specifically. A letter might actually have a ton of good information. It might just be written in German, but those letters, people would write home after they got here. And so if you can find anybody in the family that might have those old letters, there might be some clues that can help you connect back to, again, the town in which they came from. Might also identify relatives, so you'll know who you're looking for when you start researching in their country of origin. Also, keep in mind things like pictures. A lot of times we discount pictures because it's, what is it going to show me? But look for things like the name of a studio on the front of the picture, or people would write notes on the back of a picture, or there might even be visual clues within the picture. Hey, they're standing in front of this really gorgeous old Gothic looking building. That might help you figure out, oh, that's from this area of France or this area of England. So pay attention to those things. There might be something that you have in your possession that might give you some clues to figuring out where your immigration or your immigrant ancestor came from. Make sure that you're spending a lot of time with census records. Census records are so incredibly valuable, but I don't think that we really spend the time we need to mining censuses for information. So kind of just going through all of the censuses, think about what kinds of questions were asked on individual census years that will provide clues to immigration. From 1820 to 1840, they actually asked the question, how many people in this household are foreigners, is the term they used. What they mean is people who have not been naturalized. So that would be a clue, hey, my ancestor was an immigrant, but in the census it says there's 0 foreigners, so they've already naturalized. And we'll talk more about naturalization in a minute. Starting with 1850 forward, you get a place of birth. Now, if you're researching in Germany and your ancestor was here by 1850, prior to 1871, there isn't what we know as Germany. Instead, you're going to get something like Prussia or Brandenburg or Hanover. And that's a good clue as well. That, I mean, you don't yet have the town, but you do know a region of Germany. So make sure that you're paying attention to those censuses. Start in 1870, they actually asked the question whether this is a male who's a citizen 21 years of age and older. Pretty much they're looking for voters. However, that's going to give you a clue whether your ancestor is naturalized. From 1880 to 1930, it asked for the place of birth of father and mother, and that also is listed on the sample lines for the 1940 and 1950 censuses. From 1900 to 1930, they actually asked about immigration specifically. So they asked for the year of immigration and the number of years in the United States, which you would think would be about the same question, but they do list them as 2 separate answers. From 1910 to 1920, it asks for your native tongue. Now, this can be really valuable, especially if your ancestor came from that area of Eastern Europe that's constantly changing hands. So it might be that it says your ancestors from Austria, but then it might actually indicate that the native tongue is something like Bohemian or some other similar language, Bohemian being, I believe, Czech, modern day Czech. So the native tongue can tell you, they're saying Austria because it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the native tongue is going to actually help you narrow down within the Austro-Hungarian Empire where your ancestor is actually from. 1920 actually asked for the native tongue of the parents in case that's different from the respondent's native tongue. From 1900 to 1950, the census is asked for naturalization information. There's some little codes, NA being naturalized, PA papers filed, AL alien. Though in 1950, they actually just asked the question, yes or no, are they naturalized? And then the 1920 census asked for the year of naturalization. Going to give you some good clues to track down naturalization, which can lead to immigration. So here's an example of a census record. This record actually has a line for a man named Hector, and then if you actually say that phonetically, the name is actually Hector Boyardee. You might have heard of Hector Boyardee as he started a food company, and he's also known as Chef Boyardee. But he was, according to the census, he was born in 1897 in Italy. He immigrated in 1914, and he had filed his first papers. That PA stands for papers filed. Another record that might have some information about where your ancestor came from are vital records. So look for their marriage here in the United States, their death record, and then also track down the records for all of the children. Consider that the death certificates, especially 20th century death certificate, says, what's the name of your father and where was he born? Now, usually you get things like Germany, but once in a while you get somebody who lists a town of birth. Here's an example of an actual marriage record. This marriage record, and I'll pull it out so you don't have to try and read that hard to read handwriting, is actually from St. Louis, Missouri in 1843. A very, very, very energetic German evangelical minister actually listed the towns of birth in Germany for the people he married. So here we have Mr. Frederick, I'm going to slaughter these names, I can tell you that, Sporlater of Fürstenberg, Braunschweig? I'm probably saying this completely wrong. And then, of course, who he's marrying and where she comes from in Germany in an 1843 marriage record. So don't discount vital records for giving you some clues about immigration. You also want to look for obituaries. Good obituaries are going to give you a lot of detail. This is an obituary where it says Mr. Rose was born in Offenbach, Prussia, Germany, October 23rd, 1842. When he was 14 years of age, he came alone to America and landed in New York. So that gives you at least a sense of when he immigrated, and you can start looking for passenger lists. And you also have a town of birth just from this wonderful obituary. Don't forget church records. A lot of immigrants would hold on to their connections to their religious community. So just like with vital records, look for their marriage. If they married here in the United States, look for burial records, and then the church records for their children as well. You just don't know what you're going to find when you get one really, really highly energetic priest who just writes everything down. So here's an example of a church record. Now, this particular church record is written in German, so I won't have you read that. However, it says that Heinrich Mahl was born in Rauschenberg, Kurhessen, which is in Hesse-Nassau, and we've got a date of birth, and he died in Indiana. So he's buried in Indiana, left a son and a daughter. Wonderful information. So don't forget to look at the church records because they might give you some immigration clues. Also take a look at county histories. County histories, especially those published in the late 19th century, we sometimes call these mug books. Mug books just being that you're kind of mugging for the camera, but they've got these great biographies included in them. Sometimes that's actually how they would defray the cost of publication, as people could pay them to publish their biographies. So some of these biographies are extremely detailed with a lot of great information. And if your ancestor was an immigrant, there might be some clues. So here's an example of this individual's named Robert Moore. It says he was born May 3rd, 1843, near Loughbrickland, County Down, Ireland, the birthplace of his ancestors for several generations. And then it gives us clues about his actual immigration as well. It says that when he was 15 years and 6 months old, I love how specific that is, he accompanied his uncle William T. Shannon to America, and they made the ocean voyage in the steamship City of Baltimore, which did not land at Baltimore, but landed in New York. So great detail in this county history. And I didn't include this, but this particular biography in this county history actually lists out his ancestors for 4 generations. So lots of good detail. Another place that you can find immigration information is in naturalization records. Naturalization is the process of becoming a citizen. Naturalization, the first Naturalization Act was passed in 1790, and it required a 3-part process to naturalize. So first you have the Declaration of Intent. I declare my intention to become a citizen of the United States of America and give up my loyalty to the King of Great Britain or the King of wherever. So that's oftentimes referred to as the first papers, the petition, which happens a few years later, second or final papers, and then a few months after that, as the certificate is issued that this individual has indeed naturalized and is now a citizen of the United States. Now, from 1790 to about 1906, naturalization records can be interesting and once in a while have a lot of great clues. But what you really want is your ancestor have naturalized after the Naturalization Act of 1906, which went into effect in September of 1906. This act actually standardized the naturalization process because one of the big issues had been that you could naturalize in any court that you want to, which makes finding naturalization records a little bit difficult. But after about 1906, though they didn't change the requirement, it just became a lot more common for people to naturalize in federal district courts. So that's where you kind of look for those records. However, under the Naturalization Act of 1906, the required information to naturalize include the date and place of your birth, the date and port of immigration, which means you can go find the passenger list, your current address, your foreign address, and you'll get the name and birth information for your spouse and your children, and oftentimes marriage information as well. So a lot more detail in these post 1906 naturalization records. What's also wonderful is after 1906, even though you could naturalize in any court, all of those documents actually had to be filed. A copy of those documents actually were filed with the INS, or the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which in the early 2000s changed its name to the United States, the USCIS, the United States Citizen and Immigration Service. Let me get the right names for that acronym. So just keep in mind, what's great is that the USCIS actually holds copies of all naturalization records from 1906 forward. This is an example of a naturalization record. This individual might be pretty familiar to you. You might have heard of him. His name is Dr. Albert Einstein. So these are his actual naturalization papers. The United States National Archives put these online. And you'll notice he's got this great information about where he came from. It says, I was born in Ulm, Germany on March 14th, 1879. Then it says the name of my wife is Elsa. We were married on April 6, 1917 at Berlin, Germany. And she was born in this town in Germany on this date. Then we entered the United States on June 3rd, 1935 for permanent residence. Then it says I have 2 children and their names are Albert and Edward, and they're both born and residing in Switzerland. Lots of good information in this one naturalization record. So again, naturalization gives us lots of immigration clues. Another place you want to look for information about immigration is in military records. Think about, there's enlistment records, pension records, draft registration cards, discharge records, personnel files. There's pension, like I mentioned, pension. There's just so many records. However, what you'll probably find is that the 20th century records are much more likely to list a town of birth. One of my favorite records in all of this are the World War II draft registration cards, specifically those for the 4th draft, also known as the old man's draft. That draft was meant to figure out who would be left if we drafted all the men, all the younger men, and it includes men who were born between 1877 and 1897. So here we got all of these immigrants who've been in the country for years and years. And on that World War II draft card, let me pull one up for you. It actually asks the question, where were you born? And they wanted the town or county in your country. So this particular World War II draft card is for somebody you may recognize. I included a picture so you would recognize him. His name was Charlie Chaplin, and he was an early 20th century movie star. I believe he did silent movies. But in this case, it says this is, again, from about 1942. He filled this card out. He was born April 16th, 1889 in London, England. And we get his full name here is Charles Spencer Chaplin. Okay, so those are all records that are just basic United States records that actually provide clues to immigration. So you want to make sure that you've exhausted all of those records before you start looking in Germany. See what the US has to offer. But next, let's talk about immigration records themselves, those passenger lists that I've referred to a few times. Now, we'd like to kind of break up passenger lists. We split them into 2 time periods. Those that were created prior to the 1891 Immigration Act and those that were created after the 1891 Immigration Act, because that 1891 Immigration Act really changed the requirements for passenger lists. So the earlier ones we oftentimes refer to as customs lists because they are the passenger lists that were filed with the customs agent at the port of arrival. So again, customs, that's where the term comes from. Unfortunately, these lists did not require a lot of information. So the required information is like name, age, occupation, country of origin, and intended country of settlement. That's all that was required. However, there weren't actually official forms created. So it was pretty much up to the person creating the passenger list what they would list. They had to include that required information, but once in a while you get somebody who added a lot more detail because they wanted to or they thought they needed to. So still look for these customs lists, but a little bit less information. This is an example of a customs list. You'll notice not a lot of detail. Let's focus in on a family. This is the Weiss family. We just get the names, the ages of the family members. Of course, they are coming as a group, which is very helpful. And I did want to point out they have a 3-year-old in the household named Eric. Eric Weiss, and they came from Hungary. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Eric's other name or his stage name, but he's also known as Harry Houdini. So this is Harry Houdini's passenger list as he entered the United States. The other time period that we have passenger lists are those post-1891 immigration lists, and these have a lot more detail. So that 1891 Immigration Act actually said, okay, we want to gather a lot more detail about these immigrants. So the name and age of the person, their occupation, where they came from, their marital status, the name of a relative and their final destination in the United States, their last residence, their town of birth after the 1906 Naturalization Act was passed, their name and address of their closest living relative in their homeland, which is awesome information. Again, it's only after 1907, But if you're looking to figure out where they come from, hey, there's a relative and an actual street address. That's going to help you track them down. And there's a lot more information on these later passenger lists. One thing to note is that these do tend to be 2-page manifests. And so it's very easy to skip the second page. So when you do find your ancestor, make sure that you're looking for both pages. And there are areas and time periods in which when they film them, they actually film them out of order. And so the second page is first. So keep that in mind. So here's an example of an immigration list. We're going to focus again. It's got the 2 pages. We'll focus on this one line. And I know you can read it because it's all typed, but we'll pull it out a little bit. This is for a gentleman named Howard Carter, who was famously known for discovering King Tut's tomb. But we get his age, his marital status, like I was mentioning. His last permanent residence was Luxor, Egypt, and it actually tells us that he's only planning to be in the US for 6 months. So he doesn't plan to become a citizen, and that he's returning to Luxor, Egypt, not surprising, and that he's actually coming here to spend time with the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, not surprisingly. It also lists his place of birth as Swaffham, England. We also have records of border crossings. We do get people crossing the border from Canada and from Mexico. From Canada, the records start in 1895. However, they don't include Canadians on those records until 1906. So if somebody had been living in Canada for a few years before they crossed, they're considered Canadian. They might not show up on the border crossing records. Again, there's no real standard form used. From Mexico, same time period starting in 1895, there's an inspection station at Presidio, Texas. However, those inspection stations, they're not all in effect in 1895. So they kind of get constructed as needed. Again, like I mentioned, different ports have, or different crossing points have different years. And again, there's no standard form used. This is an example of a border crossing from Canada. This is actually what I love. This card is actually for a man named Frank DeMasi, but it tells us that when he actually crossed the border, his name was Francesco Sabatino de Mayo. So you kind of see that there has been a little bit of change in his name. Most likely he anglicized it the longer he was in the United States. It also tells us he was born in Vitola, Italy, and that he's 53 years old. So good information if you want to track him and trace him into Italy. This is an example of a border crossing actually out of Mexico. And what's really fun about this one is because this is a gentleman with his family that are crossing the border, they actually included a picture of him on the front of the card and his family on the back of the card. And so you can kind of see his name is Jesus Gonzalez, and it lists his wife's name and the names of all of his children, the ones that we saw the really nice picture for. It's kind of fun things that you can find in these border crossings, especially once they started adding pictures. We also have passport applications. Passports are filed when a naturalized citizen wanted to return home. There was some benefit to getting a passport. Specifically, let's say you come from a country where there's required military service. If you go home and don't prove that you've now become a naturalized United States citizen, they might press you into service. So people would get passports. Their earliest passport was issued actually in 1796, though mostly they're for diplomatic purposes early on, and then they're really not required until the 20th century. But there's a lot of good information on those passport applications: date and place of birth, date and place of naturalization, their current residence. So here's an example of a passport application for a man named Irving Berlin, who famously wrote a number of songs, including White Christmas. He says, "I was born in Mogilev, Russia on May 11th, 1888. My father's name was Moses, and he was born in Russia. He is now deceased, and that I came to the United States in 1892. There's also, so those are kind of records that are immigration records of people immigrating into the US. There are some resources for people who are departing from homelands, or some records or resources that you can use. Keep in mind, however, that these are not that complete. And so you really, again, want to focus on the US records. But some records from homelands, there are a few countrywide indexes. I always like to think of the Family Search's early collections that were called the IGI, or the International Genealogical Index. That is still out there on Family Search if you want to use it, where they try to extract a lot of records from a country, but they're never complete. So kind of keep in mind, that not only are they incomplete, it's sometimes if your ancestor was John Smith and you just go stick John Smith in, how do you know which person in which town is actually yours and that your ancestor actually appears in that database? So they're kind of a last resort record to give you some clues, but don't spend too much time on these. But there are some collections. I talked about the IGI on Family Search. Think about also things like the General Register Office of Indexes from the UK, and there are some other countrywide databases that might be beneficial. So this is the UK's General Register Office indexes for births and deaths. England started keeping births, marriages, and death records in 1837. So if you have enough detail here in the US, you can sometimes figure out or find their birth in the UK. There are some emigration records or port of departure records that are available for if you're leaving a country or departing from a specific port. There's some available, just kind of, it's again hit and miss what has survived, but do pay attention. If you know your ancestor came out of Hamburg, there are the Hamburg passenger lists or the port of departure records. So here's an example from the Hamburg passenger lists where this is actually, I believe, an index card, just gives you some information as they left Hamburg. But you'd want to know for sure from the records here in the US that they did leave from Hamburg and not from another port. You can also look at things like surname distribution maps. So especially if your ancestor had kind of a unique surname, then a surname distribution map just tells you where that surname is located in the country of origin. There's a number of different maps that can be available. There's a great wiki page that can point you in the direction for these. But again, this is more like a last resort record where you've exhausted all the US records and you still don't know where in Italy to look for your ancestor's place of birth. Next, let's just talk about some strategies when you're doing immigration research. First off, make sure that you're doing cluster methodology or fan club research. Cluster methodology is just the idea that the other people in your ancestor's life might have the same origin, because people tend to migrate in groups. We talked about families or relatives writing letters home and saying, hey, come, there's more space out here than you would think. Or you get ethnic groups that settle together. And so there could be some clues, maybe not in your ancestors' records, but in the records of the people that are in their lives. So what you want to do is go through your ancestors' records and identify anybody, the witnesses on their records, guardians, executors, administrators in a probate, neighbors on a census or from a land record. If you've got church records, look at the godparents or the sponsors, or look where the parish priest came from. Maybe they have a common origin. Or if you do find the passenger list, but you still don't know where in Germany they came from, look where the other people came from on that same ship manifest. So this is an example from my own family where this is my ancestor. His name was Johann Noblaw, or as he went by John once he came to the US. And he came in 1856 at the age of 15. Now, for a long time, I found this passenger list. Oh, this is great, but he came at 15. I don't know what to do with this. Until one day I actually noticed something, that he actually appears to be with another family. And the individual's name is Andre, and I'm not going to try and say that surname. It looks like Freij or ZJ. So I don't speak German, so I'm not exactly sure what that name is. The one great thing is, or the one thing that I found is that Johann had actually come from Württemberg, and Württemberg has a really great emigration records. So I went and actually found Johann in the immigration records, and lo and behold, look who is also signing his immigration papers is the same individual that was on the same ship. And that's why I think he came with him, is because this individual signed his immigration papers as well. So I kind of had ignored that for years. It's only when I found the immigration records that I thought, oh, wait a second, going back to the passenger list, it's the same guy. I should have been paying more attention. So pay attention to the other people in your ancestor's life. Also, make sure that you're searching for name variations. Look for initials, middle names, nicknames, maiden names. Look for the longer variation or more original spellings. I once helped a guest at the library who told me they were looking for a French-Canadian family in California, and the surname was King. So I spent a while looking for the surname King, and I finally found the family under the surname Roy, or ROI, which is French for kings. English, or they were actually still using the original French version. Then also make sure that you're learning about language and tradition of your ancestors' homeland. Is it common for the women from that country to come under their maiden names or immigrate that way? Learn about these things. That's going to help you find the records. So for the fun of it, I thought it'd be interesting to take a given name that we're really familiar with. William. What other ways can William be spelled or said? And let's start looking for the equivalent of William in other languages. So you get Wilhelm or William or Guillermo, or a lot of other different versions. So if all you ever look for is William, you might be skipping the records with your ancestor's name. So don't just look for the translation, but also look for the nicknames like Will or Bill or Liam, for that matter, or even Memo or Guy are all nicknames for William. Also look for variations with the surname. This is an example I found where I have 3 marriage records for 3 brothers named William, Robert, and George Basin, who all married in Cleveland in the early 1940s. So same surname, same parents, are clearly brothers. And I went looking for them in the census, and it took me forever because when I finally found them, there's the whole family. William and Anne are the parents, with William, Robert, and George. They're under the surname Basendowski. Well, what's going on here is, think about the time period. We're moving into World War II, where Germans are not exactly looked upon with great respect. It's possible that the family decided to anglicize the name from Basendowski to Basin and just drop the end of the name. Also spend time, researching the ethnic group or the group of people they probably immigrated with. People tended to maintain their community because they could still speak their language and kind of live the same culture that they had where they came from. So you'll find the ethnic groups, they immigrated together, they'll settle together, they'll attend the same church, they'll actually print newspapers still in old German script. Lots of good information if you can kind of dig into the community they came with. And think a lot of genealogy societies today are still based on ethnic groups. There's a Polish genealogical society or a Jewish genealogical society or Italian genealogical society. So you can reach out and work with these groups of people who are familiar with the language and tradition and cultures of your immigrant ancestors' homeland. And then finally, the one last suggestion is that as you get into the country of origin, or you get into your ancestor's homeland and you think you found a candidate, this is my ancestor, you want to verify that it's actually your ancestor. So step 1 is to, find the candidate. Hey, this is good. But step 2 is you're going to try and disprove that they're your ancestor. So kind of follow them to the end of their life. Look at birth, marriage, and death records. Look at records in surrounding localities. Because what you want to do is verify that this person actually disappears from their homeland about the same time that they appear in the United States. Because if you think this is your ancestor, then you go forward and you find him getting married and having 7 children, that's clearly not your ancestor. So you need to continue searching. So finally, in our last few minutes, I just want to touch on some immigration resources. There's a lot of places that you can find immigration records and information. So kind of think about what websites have immigration records. And I'm going to focus here just on the immigration records themselves. Keep in mind, there's a lot of other databases out there for, census records and for county histories and for obituaries, the other things we talked about earlier. But Ancestry.com has a huge number of immigration records. They do have a big collection. It's called the Passenger and Immigration List Index, 1500s to 1900s. Now, I do want to point this collection out specifically because there's a famous collection or a set of volumes, printed volumes, that we sometimes refer to as Philbys, which is they're compiled by William Philby. And the set of volumes is called the Passenger and Immigration List Index. And it was started at about 1982, and a new volume was published almost every year. And it indexes all of these other records. And it's an awesome set of books. And Ancestry.com has acquired these books up to a certain time period. The last time I checked, it was up to 2012. So just keep in mind that if you're looking for the Philby books, they're actually part of this collection on Ancestry. And then Ancestry has a number of other wonderful collections that you'll want to take a look at. A Family Search also has a huge number of immigration collections: New York, Philadelphia, Passport, Border Crossings, and so forth. So kind of keep in mind there's great resources there. Find My Past also has a number of good immigration resources. Specifically, Find My Past is a UK website, but they do have the passenger lists of people leaving the UK from 1890 to 1960. Keep in mind that they did start keeping track of those departing, but not until 1890. They have some other great resources, including Germans to America. There are some other resources that you can look at the Family Search Research Wiki. ellisisland.org is a great website. They have a lot of the passenger manifests for those who arrived at Ellis Island. And then for those who are interested more in the naturalization side of things, want to order your naturalization records, make sure that you check out the USCIS's website as well. Okay, so our objectives today, we wanted to talk about some history and background of immigration into the United States. We talked about the immigration clues in U.S. records, so what records here in the U.S. give you clues about your immigration. Then we talked about immigration and homeland records. Then we talked some research strategies, focusing on those different name spellings, looking at the fan club or the group that they lived with. And then we ended with just touching on some immigration resources. So I hope this has given you kind of a good overview of immigration into the United States and how you want to approach your immigration strategy. Again, don't start researching in Germany just because you know they were born in 1863. Make sure that you're exhausting the records here in the United States first. So do we have any questions that we want to address?
Yes, I think we do. Thank you, Beth, so much. And it was a perfect segue ending on the Germany comment. We had a question come in from Carrie on YouTube, and she asked, are there resources for searching records in German for folks who don't know the German language? I know in September, there will be a German expert teaching about getting started in German family history, but do you have any tips for Carrie?
That's such a great question. That trying to research in a country that you're unfamiliar with can be kind of daunting, honestly. I would start by looking at the Family Search Research Wiki and look for the German word lists. So that's going to help you kind of to figure out what are the key words that you're looking for. And then there's actually some helps that I've used. I don't speak German at all, but when I went looking for those Württemberg immigration records, I actually pulled it up on my phone and I said, well, that letter looks like that letter, and that letter looks like that letter. And that's how I found the right record. So, take advantage of that. There's also some good training materials out there in the wiki about how to learn how to read German. If you've got a lot of German ancestors, may as well spend the time learning to read the German script.
I love that. And I just went ahead and put in the chat the link to the Germany regional page on the wiki. And from there, you can search so much. It's just a wealth of resources there. Great question, Carrie. And we have about 1 minute left. Let's go ahead and ask this question from Melinda. How to find ancestors in England and Scotland?
It's a great question, but I think with a lot of things, it's all comes down to a location and time period. So England isn't specific enough. We need to know a town. And if you're talking post 1837 England, things are a little bit easier. You've got the census records back to 1841. You have the civil registration back to 1837. But if you don't know the town in England and you're talking pre-1837, you need to exhaust the resources in the US. Now, once you know the town, there's a lot of great resources. They've got great parish registers. But I do have a lot of good coworkers who can help more with that, since my specialty is the United States. So you might even, if you've got a specific ancestor you're looking for, I put up a link that's up there right now. Sign up for a virtual consultation with one of our English specialists or our Scottish specialists, and they can help you kind of narrow down what you're looking for.
I love that resource, and that's available to anybody to get that free consultation. So make sure that you take advantage of it. Such amazing experts that we have at the Family Search Library. Beth, thank you so much for being with us today. For those of you that are watching the replay, please continue to ask your questions. For those questions that we did not get to, we're going to send those to Beth to make sure that we can get answers, and we will get you answers to your questions. These resources, these videos will live on all the sites that we publish them on, so feel free to share them. They're not going down, so you can watch anytime you want. If you came in halfway through, you can start from the beginning. And again, thank you so much, Beth, and thanks everyone for tuning in.